P Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine. We have a very engaging program for you this evening featuring Fabienne Marsh, who's here to talk about her latest novel, Juliet Rising, in conversation with Jeff Greenfield. For those of you not familiar with how this virtual format works, although you're not visible to us, you'll still be able to ask a question if you'd like. To do so, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. The chat function also will be active, and in that column, you'll find a link for purchasing a copy of Juliet Rising. This is Fabienne's fourth novel. You'll hear more about her work in a minute. She's also done some nonfiction writing and worked on a number of TV documentaries over the years. She served as a writer consultant for Nickelodeon, HBO, Turner Broadcasting, and Public Broadcasting, and has taught literature and creative writing at Loyola in Baltimore, and has been the journalism advisor for the Chadwick School in California. So quite a range of experiences. Juliet Rising centers around a New Yorker who, after her husband's death, moves with her daughter to Oregon to teach and to reestablish her life. The book follows Juliet as she navigates the many challenges that often face a single parent in a new location, and as she confronts her past, present, and possible future. The story's filled with joy, sadness, humor, and grief, a spectrum of emotions, characters, and plot twists. As one online reviewer put it, this book is for anyone who's lost people they love, made mistakes in their life, yet persevered in making a new life work with all its inconsistencies and questions. The conversation with Fabienne will be Jeff Greenfield. As I said, he's an award-winning broadcast journalist and author whose work has focused on politics, media, and culture. He served as senior political correspondent for CBS, a senior analyst for CNN, and a political and media analyst for ABC News. He's also authored or co-authored 14 books and written for a number of prominent publications. And he and Fabienne have known each other since their days together at ABC. So Fabienne and Jeff, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Bradley. A pleasure to be back, more or less, at Politics and Prose. I've been there trying to books about politics. This is a very different kind of experience because I'll be talking with Fabienne Marsh, who is among other things, as Bradley said, a novelist who is not only wide-ranging, but whose novels are so steeped in rich character that you care about. Almost the opposite of reading about politics, most of whose people you wish would go away. The critics have been more than kind to Fabienne. They have loved her work, and not just critics. Long Distances, her first novel, Pat Conroy wrote, "This book is pure magic. I loved reading every page of it. Long Distances is the debut of a superb new writer." And coming-of-age novel she wrote, The Moralist of the Alphabet Streets. Michael Lewis, as far as I'm concerned, cannot write a dull sentence, wrote, "Marsh has written a wonderful book. There's a little wisdom in every sentence and laughter on every page. I cried until I laughed." And we're actually going to be talking about two books, Juliet Rising, but also Single White Caveman, a novel about divorce in the Middle Age, but with a twist, which is that the protagonist is a guy. So good to see you.
Good to see you.
East Coast, but the book is set in Portland, Oregon. So how does that mix in? How does your East Coast life fit in with ones up?
I have a huge East Coast connection. I was born in Schenectady, New York. I attended public school in Westchester County. I went to college in Massachusetts, and I worked 17 years in New York City, mostly documentaries. My children were born in Baltimore, Maryland, and I taught writing in various colleges, one of them on the DC campus for Johns Hopkins, a graduate program not far from the bookstore, Politics and Prose. Single White Caveman takes place in Connecticut. Oh, and Rosso went to school at Dartmouth, which is in New Hampshire. So
Okay.
my heart and my homies, some of them are here today, are on the East Coast.
Which raises the question, what is Juliet doing in Portland, Oregon?
That's a great question. I think
Maybe their book will tell us.
yes. For starters, I want to show the cover because this is, for those of you who have not been to Oregon, this is the beautiful, beautiful, iconic Cannon Beach in Oregon. It's such a spectacular state. And the kite that you see there, consistent with the themes in this book, we asked the cover artist to, I don't know if you can see it, to put in the colors of the Day of the Dead, because in this book, the bereavement group studies how other cultures deal with loss. So they actually go to San Miguel de Allende in Mexico, and they attend the Day of the Dead ceremonies.
Okay, that's given us a look inside the book, but guess where it starts? Because I still want you to tell us how Juliet winds up in Portland. You can read from it if you'd like.
Yes. Okay. That's a good cue. Thank you, Jeff. I will read from it. This is the setup for the book. And, well, I'll just let it speak for itself. I moved to Oregon after the father of my children blew up our brownstone on West 97th Street, New York City. I had no doubt the move would be better for our children, though I worried they would never have a normal childhood. 2 years later, I confessed to pining for some of the very things that drove me west. People out here are so protein powder, low carb, healthy, and laid back that I miss my wine swigging, cigarette sneaking, bipolar friends in New York. Today, Pat, that's her best friend, called me to tell me that the New York Times had an article about a bereavement group she wants me to attend. They're doing very interesting work, she said. I think the bereavers are in your neck of the woods. Which neck would that be? I asked. Tryon Creek State Park, isn't that near Portland? I am always giving Pat geography lessons, as I do for all New Yorkers. I begin with Lewis and Clark, the Louisiana Territory, and Thomas Jefferson. In the Pacific Northwest, the expedition's goal was to learn where the continent ended. When I get carried away about Lewis's noble dog, Seaman Sacagawea, and the difficult winter at Fort Clatsop, Pat always interrupts. I really don't give a rat's ass about the Indians or the explorers. So I ask her what she does care about. Everybody's dying, she says. And here we go again. Because what Pat says is true. 4 years ago, Pat's husband died of ALS. 1 year later, she lost her mother to breast cancer. And 3 months ago, her Pomeranian rescue died of congestive heart failure.
So this is early signal to the reader that we're going to be dealing with loss in this book. We're going to be dealing with grief, with mourning. And I think maybe one of the reasons why this has gotten ready from people like Anne Lamott, who is of a new, I think of her as a saint, but that's just me. Why it hit so hard was because last year, whether we've lost individual people we've loved, a million of Americans have, we've lost a whole lot. We've lost friendships and caring and being with each other, the whole communal so that, and I want to signal very early to people listening that one of the really remarkable things that you've done here, I think, is it is infused, as we'll see soon, with loss and grief and mourning, and yet it is funny. It is in some sense uplifting, like that kite. That's what Anne was getting. There is a real feeling Juliet and are going to make their way through this. But I know that you also had in your East-West movement, you have a little thing here where you play off the differences between East and West, if you'd like to share that with us.
I'd love to, because there are huge differences.
Yeah. Trying.
Good news, the good news is that in Lake Oswego, nobody gives you the finger, even after you've caused a 3-car pileup. When waiting to make a left turn, few people honk you into oncoming traffic. You don't get the misplaced rage. The bad news is that I'm bored. There's no edge here, only laid back, militantly laid back. Pat, Bill, and I are trying to make a list in defense of Edge, but it was a very mixed bag. Some ties, some clear victories for laid back. Edge, RSVPs. Laid back doesn't even show up. Edge returns phone calls. Laid back does not. Edge chops down trees to receive badly needed light. Laid back makes it a criminal offense. Edge keeps psychiatrists in business. Laid back does not. Edge has restaurants with New York minute service. Laid back reassures customer that baby lettuce did not suffer when it met its forager. Edge produces better hair stylists and colorists. Laid back grows out gray. Edge is competitive, and laid back is laid back. Edge gets you fired, laid back gets you fired. Tie score. Edge produces white collar criminals who live in luxury homes. Laid back produces sociopaths who live in cabins. Edge produces art. Laid back produces crafts. Edge is too arrogant and compiles lists like this. Laid back is too relaxed and enjoying life to bother.
That hits home for me, particularly because when I moved from New York to Santa Barbara, my wife and her honk when the light changes. We don't do that out here. And I came to realize that indeed in Santa Barbara, when someone waves at you from their car, you use all their fingers. So you are absolutely dead on. But to move ahead, one of the things that Julia's friend Pat concerted you is to join this bereavement group in Portland. And here's where we begin, I think, to get at the heart of what lies at the book, because it's, as I this, obviously these people are there because they've lost some, but you realize the rate of the loss. They are lost. There's a suicide. There's a child killed in a terrible accident. There's someone lost to. There's someone lost to illness. The question I ask is, what? Speaking of characters, as the book develops, from your perspective, what is Julia getting from this experience? What does it mean to her to be surrounded by so many people who've lost in so many ways?
Well, that's a good question. She didn't want to go to the bereavement group. She doesn't like to share. She's very private. But her friend Pat, her best friend, who is coming to visit from the East Coast, having read in the New York Times that they're doing great work in the bereavement group, she said, I'm going to come out there and you're going, period. So what happened is that Pat essentially, Juliet's an outsider. She's had to move from New York. She teaches in the public school system. She teaches 4th grade. She's still an outsider. So thanks to Pat, she finds a community in this bereavement group. And the characters that I wrote, I haven't been to a bereavement group, but I understand the need to go to a bereavement group. I think that what I was trying to do, we are dealing with a pandemic, and there's a great deal of loss. But what I was trying to make each character represent without there being a cartoon was to introduce each character as representing an epidemic, the opioid crisis, the epidemic in suicide, in the military, the losses, including in the military, 20 suicides a day for veterans. These issues weighed on me very, very heavily, but the book has to be lighter than that, and they have to be real characters with real lives. They can't be cartoons, so that's where the fiction comes in. But I would like, if I may, to read two different ways of coping. They're very short, two different ways of coping with grief. And the first one is written by Juliette in a letter to the afterlife. And she's writing to her grandmother, her French grandmother. So here she goes. Do you remember when we all visited the church Van Gogh had painted in Auvers-sur-Oise? Everything in the town, including the church, looked gray and flat. The tourists would look at the church on the postcard with its undulating cobalt sky and its spire swimming piously toward the light. Then they would glance at the actual Auvers sky, pewter that day, and shift their gaze back to the very church Van Gogh had painted, a sour gray Gothic. This is it? They all seemed disappointed. This is it? I miss you, and I miss your trips with Mom and Dad. The world looks as gray and flat as Auvers these days, and I don't seem to be able to see it or paint it any other way. And that to me deals, that's one example, that deals to me with the constant fog of depression, of not experiencing the world in front of you, which is so beautiful and so joyous, because you can't. You just can't. You're suffering.
But it also strikes something very important in this book, which is that Juliet loved grandmother and loved her. And so many books are the most dysfunctional possible view of families. That's not where she's from. One of the reasons she mourns is that she really, really loves these people. I stepped on you. You wanted to read a short section?
I do. Do remember that this is fiction in terms of the characters.
Indeed.
Because, for part of me in writing, it's that even if I've had a bad experience and if there's one person that resembles somebody in my life, I always seek to redeem them. I always seek to redeem them. It is not interesting to have a character that flatlines. They all have to have some kind of arc and redemption. So yes, I would like to read you the other example, and that is on page, it's also very short. And these are the way the grandparents cope with it, because let's remember, they've lost their son. So that's on page, hold on a second. Thank you, everybody. Okay. These are the grandparents now, their point of view about grief. Chola and Christina have mastered the art of portion control for their broken, fearful hearts. They stuff their wailing inward, divide it into smaller, more manageable portions, scoop it into plastic, sealed tight containers, then stack them in the freezer. Each vessel is then pulled out on its designated Memorial Day, allowing time for its contents to thaw.
Now, we should mention that this is not a book where people simply sit around and mourn. There's a lot of action going on, a lot of conflict. Juliet's best friend, Pat, is with a guy we learn who has a rather interesting, almost Shakespearean, weird connection of sorts to Juliet. There's a guy that's interested in her, but he's not sure about what's going on with his wife. And then she's got these two kids, Sam and Grace, who are obviously of her life. Will also provide some pretty neat comic relief, I guess, particularly when it comes to learning about matters sexual. They aren't quite there yet. They've got some notions that really don't quite square with reality. There's a section there's a couple of things in your book that really I just broke up. One is this woman who will not let your daughter into the brownies. That's a small thing. But then what they think they know about sex, what sex education has and hasn't taught them. You have a little passage in here that I think is worth to indicate that this is not a dour book. This is really often a very funny book, as Anne Lamott noted. So can you share that with us as well, please?
Of course. So let me just point out once again that Juliet is a fourth grade teacher and she has to teach sex ed, but she's dreading it. So she has a fourth grader and his name is Sam. And she also has a third grader whose name is Grace. So this is really hard because she's dealing with what kids do. It's a game of telephone. And by the time you get to the end result, it makes no sense, but it's actually quite horrifying to parents, especially if they don't want to discuss the real thing. So I'll read to you about that. And this is a letter to the afterlife where Juliet is writing to her mother and father. Dear Mom and Dad, you are both very lucky that sex ed was in its primitive phases in elementary school. I graduated with A's in all my biology classes without knowing that a snake had a penis. Still hard to believe, actually. These days, seaweed has a sex life and gender is fluid. Very difficult concepts to explain to my students, and especially to Sam and Grace. Thanks to the disinformation disseminated by your granddaughter, which is Grace, my suitor thinks I'm bisexual. His wife is convinced I'm a lesbian. My son thinks I hate men. And my daughter thinks the entire state of Virginia is inhabited by virgins. All my love, Juliet. By the way, true story here. I mean, I know people like to know what's true, what's not true. It is absolutely true when I tried to resume dating in a period of my life where I had smaller children, but it was such that I didn't have them all the time and all that stuff. So one gentleman, it was very correct. We were just playing Scrabble. There was nothing intimate between us. He came up to me and he said, "It's okay, I know." And I said, "I'm sorry, what do you know?" He said, Juliet told me. By the way, Juliet is my real daughter's name. She has nothing to do with the book. Okay. So he said, "Your daughter told me." And I said, "What did she tell you?" He said, "It's okay. I know you prefer women." I said, "What?" And so Juliet apparently, so I go to Juliet, my daughter, and I said, "Honey, did you tell John I was a lesbian?" She was 11 years old and she said, "I thought you were." All I want to say is for any parents attempting to date with children this age, give up. They are saboteurs. They are saboteurs. I just gave up for 10 years. And then my son, on his side, he stood over the Scrabble board and he said, "Are you dating my mother?" So this poor guy said, "I thought we were playing Scrabble." So just beware. It is absolutely impossible to date if you love your kids and they really need you. It's just impossible. So just give up. We'll get to dating with single white cavemen.
Okay. So another career as Jerry is clearly works here for you, right? As this novel progresses, um, one of the set pieces that is this, I'll use the word dramatic, is, as you mentioned at the outset, this bereavement group decide to go to Mexico to participate in the dead. And that, as it turns out, that has tremendous resonance in, if I may say so, some extremely, extremely successful erotic episodes with your two members. Well, you read those parts because this is, it's
I've never had to write an entire chapter about sex. Never. And it's not graphic at all.
Oh, well, you may have cost some sales there.
No, it's very naughty and really fun and exciting, but it is not, there's no vulgarity.
The reason that I alluded to that is that in a way, it reflects back on something that struck me about actually both books, which is that these are good people.
Mm-hmm.
Fundamentally, they're flawed and they make mistakes, but they're good people. So it's almost like, all right, I'm going to reward these two women so much with some really enjoyable experiences. But beyond that, what do these characters, I don't know if we can describe all of them the same way, what do they take the experience of the day of the happens to them when they're down in Mexico? Any one of them, or presumably they're there as a novelist, you put them there for a reason.
Yeah, well, they're down there because one of the bereavers is a librarian. Her name is Macy, and she tries to make it, she wants them to read. She gives them a book list, of course, Tibetan Book of the Dead, C.S. Lewis, and all those things. But what really happens is that during the course of the bereavement group and being down in Mexico, they truly grieve. They don't just grieve emotionally, but when they're in Mexico, they start making the creches that you make. So it becomes physical. They have to put mementos that mean things to them. And it's a very beautiful process that becomes not only emotional, but also tactile. Do you want me to read the passage?
I think that's a good idea. Take it, yeah.
Okay. So this is when they're on the plane to Mexico, and it just gives you a sense of the characters just by what they're watching on the screen. Okay. On the plane to Mexico, I'm watching a series about a World War II nurse who travels back in time to 17th century Scotland. I am comforted by the hundreds of TV screens nestled into our cabin's digital quilt of humanity. Maisie is arguing convivially with Jesse that 6 Feet Under is much better than Sons of Anarchy until he applies his earbuds, retreating into a sonic cocoon with Steppenwolf. Anne is watching Bridesmaids. Mike is watching Pulp Fiction. Jim is transfixed by a documentary on Princess Diana. Cheryl is watching Dancing with the Stars. Samantha is watching Mrs. Doubtfire. Pat is chewing her 15th piece of Nicorette, enthralled by reruns of Meerkat Manor. Bill is writing a speech on his laptop. As our flight attendant's cart approaches with in-flight snacks, Jim wipes his seat and armrests with Lysol. Samantha and Cheryl wring their hands with Purell. Anne warns us that lettuce washed with local water in Mexico can give us gut-busting giardia. Macy asks if we bought a mosquito repellent with DEET now that we're traveling to a country with confirmed cases of Zika. Pat advises me to slide the exit latch in the bathroom with my knuckle. And suddenly I am wondering if what I've been teaching my students all these years is insufficient. Sneeze inside your elbows and wash your hands with soap and water while singing Happy Birthday twice. We have all suffered so much. And here we are at 30,000 feet, leveraging mortality by declaring war against 99.99% of all microbes. This absurd side to our bereavement group amuses me. And I'm happy because for the first time in years, my flight is free of hurricanes, volcanoes, and alabaster sorrow. So
I think,
this was written, I just want to say this was written before COVID, and already people getting on planes were doing that thing. Sorry, go ahead.
No, but I was like, a bit of prescience there in scrubbing everything down. So before I'm going to turn to the other book in a minute. But I just the kind of question, I guess, that an author might find, kind of I don't know if it's annoying, I hope not. But are you conscious, or were you conscious in this book of balancing the serious or the painful parts of these characters' life with the humor? I mean, was there a sense in that as you're writing, you think, I need a little levity here. I need a little lightheartedness here. Or that just come in a way that you can't outline or predict or plot?
Well, first of all, I had no idea where I was going with this. I knew that this is truly one of the most semi-autobiographical works I have ever written. I experienced within 12 months the loss of my mother, my father, my grandmother, my marriage, moving from the East Coast to the West Coast. So that I knew was something I wanted to pay homage to people I love. That was very clear to me. That doesn't make a plot. That doesn't make fiction. So the explosion, metaphorically, was, by the way, the explosion, true story. This explosion did happen in New York City. And I remember reading about this explosion and I was horrified. And it was about a man in New York City on the East Side who blew up a townhouse rather than wanting his family to inherit anything. That's a true story. And I thought to myself, I guess in film they'd call it an inciting incident. It's what unravels the plot. I didn't know where it was going to go. I had no idea. This is one of the most complicated books I've ever written to figure it out. But I knew by making a choice, it precludes some choices and opens up other choices. So it was like an algorithm. It was very hard. But the point is, I do think that this explosion gave me a focus for what I was supposed to do. And by the way, I do have a friend who went to visit the crater in New York City on the East Side, but then the fiction comes in. So like, what am I going to do with this crater? Oh yeah, they'll find Peter Stuyvesant's wig curler or something like. That's the art, that's the research and all that stuff. But I had no idea what I was doing. But in answer to your question, did I think about, oh, I need humor here, I need this here, I need that? I don't think that way. I think that this voice of Juliet is so close to my voice that even with the narration, which is coming out in an audiobook soon, I told her to read it like a memoir.
Question from the audience for you, which follows right on what we were talking about. Your writing is very funny, even when the subject is grief. Is it hard to write humor? Do you think it makes tough topics easier to read when there's some humor mixed in?
I think it makes it easier to write, because I don't think that any life is completely bereft of humor. I remember seeing the movie Frances and I walked out. I'm like, come on, man, this is just so dismal. I just couldn't handle it. So I think that's just the way I see the world. And of course, I'm thinking like, who's gonna read this? It's depressing me. so I just try to give a lift to things because I think that I'm constitutionally, that's who I am constitutionally.
I want to turn to other books. We are talking about two books here. This is called Single White Caveman. It is evident that this heroic figure is carrying a golf club. I think it tells us something about his background, his status in life. What are we looking at there?
That's a Labrador Retriever.
Oh, the dog. Yes, I'm sorry. I gotta get my eyes checked. It was now that it's close, I see it's a dog. But let's turn to the book because, as I mentioned at the beginning, cleverly, it's a book about a middle-aged person who's divorced, and guy. And the most blatantly bladed question I could even think of, but somebody's going to ask it, might as well be, is, was it hard to put yourself in mind of a man going through this experience?
No, it wasn't hard at all. I love men. I get men. I know how they tick. I don't think they're that much different in terms of what they want. And this really is a Valentine. This is a fairy tale. It has a beautiful ending. I won't go into it. But this poor slob, he never expected to be divorced at 38 in the suburbs.
Right there, because you're going to tell us how at the beginning of the book you describe what happened in the marriage. And I would like you to share that with us.
Sure, I will. I just want to say, I want people to see the back cover because it's really funny. When I was working with the artist, I said, this guy is selling himself. Why not put in the for sale sign in front of his house? Why not put his bio? And we'll get to the bios, but the first line of the book says it all. Jim Rosso was anticipating a lonely millennium. And remember, it's a period piece. It's, you know, it takes place in, well, we'll get to that.
Indeed, we will.
Yes. Okay. So this is his first wife, Doris, and he tried really, really hard with Doris. That's why we like this guy. I like this guy. When Rosso married Doris, she was making a meager living as a bookbinder in New York City. He was 27, she was 25. At the time, her rabid hatred of any man, woman, or everyday slob who made a decent wage was amusing. Painters, poets, Buddhists, and Rosso were, of course, exempt. Many of her friends lunched every day at Dean and DeLuca in Soho. The one time Rosso was invited, he ended up feeling like Simon in Lord of the Flies, unwelcome and about to be sacrificed. It occurred to Rosso that after scanning the bored, hostile faces of trust funders dressed in black, that Dean and DeLuca's bottom line rested squarely on the very people Doris and her friends reviled. Their savage antipathy towards any profession that required a suit made him an instant outcast. For Rosso was a Brooks Brothers man down to his very boxers. Rosso knew everything about his ex-wife work. Each night, Rosso listened to Doris's withering doubts about her talent as a bookbinder. He agonized over every glue that was too weak and every spine that had broken. It was he who took the call from an irate librarian when a first edition of Calvino's Il Barone Rampante buckled its spine. Finally, it was he who was left with a $15,000 bill for more botched spines when Doris ran off with an outfielder for the Boston Red Sox.
Now read the next line. Read the next line.
Like Doris, the Red Sox are losers, or at the very least, they have a pathological fear of success. But Rosso loved them both. He couldn't tell you why.
That's how you know this is a period piece. Because when I read this,
you know all the stats. Go ahead.
4 World Series since, you know, for the Yankees. And then I realized, no, you got to remember when he's taking place. But I thought that was a wonderful, I thought it was a wonderful big to explain exactly where Rosso is. And what I should say is that he is looking, the reason I understand now why the for sale sign is on the back is he is trying to navigate his way through 20 years ago, through the personals, through online dating, through those kinds of matchups. And as I guess, it has blessedly not been my experience to be part of that, but I guess it can, what sentence, looking for you got to get us a lot of frogs.
And this was before, this was in the very early years. This was before Match had taken off. This was before Tinder, before JDate, before Grindr, before all that. So I found myself having to write all the bios for all these women that he would date and react to, which was really fun.
Question from one of our participants. I believe you started off as a journalist. What drew you to fiction, and is it harder to write than nonfiction?
Oh, nonfiction is a snap. It's just a snap. I'm very organized. I know what the topic is. I know how to prepare. I know how to research. Nonfiction is, for me, it's a no-brainer. Fiction, it's always impossible. It's always challenging. I don't know why I do it. I don't know why I feel compelled to do it, but I obviously do. I did start in documentaries, and I will say that gave me really good parallel lives, because it's not as if I was writing for a paralegal. It did not compete with the writing of fiction. It gave me a parallel life, so I met so many interesting people, some of whom became characters. To me, it was just fascinating to, Jeff, to interview all these fascinating people in your life and to to be a field producer and to go to so many different situations and venues. So actually that was perfect. I just
Yeah.
didn't have the time to write, and I didn't have the, I don't know if I had the, I always knew I was a writer, but it took a long time to figure out that I needed to focus more on that.
Well, I will tell you a quick story about the one novel that I wrote, because I had exactly it's nonfiction. This is what the guy looked like. This is what she's wearing. This is the house, and I'm sitting there paralyzed because I got this my character in a kind of faux Western cowboy outfit, and suddenly Dean kind of drew the journalist. I wonder what the biggest Western clothing store is in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And I looked up and I called him and I said, I want to talk to your most experienced salesman. Give me the wardrobe politician who isn't very comfortable out, how to ride a horse. What is he? And when I finished that conversation, I said, I think I can do this book. You know, I had to know, what's there. I will say mine is what Graham Greene would have called entertainment. You write novels.
But no, you're right. There is an element of research involved if that becomes necessary, and I love that part.
Yeah, I wondered, when Roth wrote An American Pastoral, which I think is maybe the great American novel, he owns a very successful glove factory. And I almost think I haven't ever figured out, maybe his biography only, whether Roth, like Balls, used to go to factories and offices and stuff, whether Roth actually spent a lot of time, in a glove factory, because he writes about it so granularly. Another question: what fiction writers inspire you, past or present? And this question asks, thank you for this wonderful presentation. So that's thank you for saying. Tell me who your, if that's the right word, your inspirations are.
Well, it's always changing. And the problem is the ones I loved when I was 17, for example, I loved Stendhal, the red and the black and all that stuff. And I loved so many of them. I loved Flaubert, and I still love Flaubert because of his, he's the king of le mot juste, which means the exact word. And I really do feel that way. And which is why it's so frustrating for me to write. It's never good enough if I don't get it right and all that stuff. So I have to say that changes over time. I don't have anyone who inspires me. They all inspire me if they're good. Last year, I think the two books that I loved the most, having read a lot of classics in college, but she just lifted and transported them, were the book called Circe. I loved that book. And by Madeline Miller.
Thank you.
And the other one was Educated. I think it's Tara Westover, is it? I don't want to get the name wrong, but I thought that was a brilliant memoir. It was kind of hard to read in the way that I found it I couldn't get through Angela's Ashes, not because it wasn't wonderful, but I found it really painful when kids are involved and they're hurt and all that. But there are so many authors. I don't know how to pronounce her name. Tessa McFeg, I really liked recently. So yeah, they're always changing.
That's a good thing, I must say that a while ago I read two books by Atkin back to back, Life After Life and A God in Ruins. Totally blown away by both of them. I just could not. I mean, it's a little humbling because you realize, that's I can't do. Let me go back to Single White Man.
By the way, I just wanted to add that I read a lot of nonfiction. I've read Hamilton by Ron Chernow. I'm 3/4 of the way through Grant. I love reading nonfiction too.
Yeah, I have to. That tends to. I've just finished the first volume of Langeville's definitive by John Kennedy. It goes up to 1956, but it's still fascinating. The reason I wanted to go back to Single White Caveman for a minute was you talk about it as a fairy tale. And indeed, after all that this poor guy Rosso goes through, give him really wonderful. We know great life for him by the last page. So, to what extent is that a case of you falling in love with your characters and just to make sure that they're going to be okay? Is that a corny way to
I
put it?
don't think I'll just speak for myself. I can't write a character that I have no empathy for whatsoever. It's kind of like, I imagine if I were an actress, I would have to find something to connect with, even with an anti-hero or heroine that is something that speaks to you. So I have to care about my characters. And as I said, I feel that I have to redeem them unless I, want to blow somebody up in the first paragraph.
I want to share something with you. I think please when I'm done. I don't have any questions, but I just want to say how fun it was to read so contemporary with current references. I was struck with how the mood we're all experiencing, all the loss and sadness stemming from the pandemic, the grief and humor made me laugh and cry and gave me. I loved how friendship sustained Juliet in a time of crisis, and it felt good to leave Juliet in a good place. So I think I can say, I don't mean to put words in your mouth. Really, this reader, I think, your book. She really, it's like she vibrated in sympathy with you. You should feel pretty good about it, right?
I do. I think I feel really good that it's. Oops, I lost you, Jeff.
Thing
Are
I
you
said.
there? Click on you. There you are. You're back. I feel good about it only because I like it when books reach people who need to read it. And when I was looking for a book to help me, I could not find one. So, and I read everything. I read C.S. Lewis, you name it, I read it. And it just didn't help me. So this book that's Juliet Rising, and this one is for all the single people, past and present. This is just, but I feel that I really wrote this book to give other people the gift of a book that I wish I had had to read when I was suffering hugely.
Another question, this is probably not the first time a writer has been asked this, but I think I'm curious. How do you decide to write first or third person vantage point?
That's a very good question. It depends on the subject. It depends on how much omniscience you want to have, distance from the character, but there are ways of writing and then writing third person and then going to what they call third person personal. So you can still get inside their heads. I just think it depends on the subject. My second one, which is a coming of age book, Moralist of the Alphabet Streets, is very different. My first book, Long Distances, is really first person because they're all letters from different people. It's an epistolary novel, right? So it's all first person from different points of view throughout the book. And that was another really tough one to write. That was like playing chess. And then, of course, Rosso is third person, but the bios, there are all these bios from women, and obviously that's first person. So I like to, I probably would have had a better and more successful career had I not shifted everything I do. It would be better to write a series or have a genre, like to have crime or to have romance or something like that. But that's, it's not what I do.
Well, this may not seem totally appropriate, but there's a guy, a wonderful crusading Joe Rao, spent his life fighting for civil rights and unions, but it fought corrupt unions. He was one of the original New Deal guys, and all the other lawyers went off and became, white collar criminal lawyers, lobbyists. And when he was given a dinner in his honor, he got up and he referenced that life. You know what? He said, they got all the money. You just lost me again. They got all the money, you hear me? But we got all the fun. So there you are. Now, are you seeing me? I seem to have.
I'm seeing you. I have to
there
say.
I am. Okay, there I am.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, I kind of like the line.
I want to read one more Rosso thing.
Yeah,
If I, it's
because we're
short.
coming to the end of the hour. So
Oh,
it goes fast.
it sure does.
So read this last thing, and then we'll.
It's very short.
That's-
It's very, I love this. And you'll have to forgive my Southern accent on this. I did spend a lot of time in the South, though, in Nags Head, North Carolina.
Okay.
Okay, so this is the end, and he's waiting to meet, and he really doesn't want this date with the boss's daughter, but it's the boss's daughter. And he's been shown a picture by the boss, and he really didn't want to do this, but he did it. Okay, so on his way to meet Lily, Rosso bought a few box sets of country music CDs to both wallow and exult in the company of lovers done wrong. He began with, "Thank God and Greyhound, you're gone." Moved on to "Flushed from the Bathroom of Your Heart," and found tremendous solace in "There Ain't No Queen in My King-Size Bed." Breaking into the second box set, Rosso smiled on hearing "If the phone don't ring, it's me," and was tickled out of a bad mood with "I gave her the ring, she gave me the finger." As he pulled into the parking lot behind Main Street in Westport, "Did I shave my legs for this?" somehow spoke to him. He really doesn't want to go.
Well, then big surprise for him. One of the last questions we had here was, are you working on a new one?
I'm recovering. I'm recovering from this one, and also from putting everything up digitally. And if anybody tells you that, as you know, Jeff, digital anything is not easy. So having just finished an audiobook for the first time with an amazing narrator who lives in Paris, and there are all these amazing creative people all over the world, that's really fun. That's the fun part of it. And covers with great designers, because you don't really have that choice unless you publish with a small, wonderful press like Windfree Press in Oregon. And thank you, Maggie Lynch. So the point is, if I do anything, it's going to be, once again, different. I'd love to do a children's book, but then we'd have to, the publishing house would have to find an illustrator. I have a lot of ideas. So I'm not working on anything currently, but I'm always incubating.
I know it's surprising sometimes because the time flies, but we are almost at the end of the hour. But before we leave, you and I both wanted to make a point about local bookstores. I mean, Politics and Prose is a godsend to Washington. Where I live in Santa Barbara, certainly the big chains went out of business years ago, but Chalk Store, an independently owned bookstore, still, even in the middle of this thing, is still hanging on. Since your books are both about the search for love, I think your point was about Valentine's Day and what people should do on Valentine's Day in terms of the cards they're buying. Have I screwed up enough?
I'm a huge fan of local bookstores. Obviously, in Oregon, it's Powell's, but for Single White Caveman, just because of my personal experience dealing with Brad, dealing with Brittany, and the staff at Politics and Prose, they've been amazing. So if you do find it in your heart to buy a loved one or somebody who's single or not, a Valentine's present, I want to put in a shout out to Politics and Prose.
I had more fun doing my stuff there than almost any other format I could think of. And with that, it's a pleasure to virtually see you again, Fabienne and Bradley. We are turning all these texts to you.
Really appreciate the plug for independent bookstores, and particularly for Politics and Prose. Great moderating, Jeff. And Fabienne, you've clearly written a book that connects with those who read it, and hopefully many more will. To all of you watching, thanks again for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link to purchase both of Fabienne's books, Juliet Rising and Single White Caveman. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well,